In the sixth and final part of this lecture, we're going to learn more about the different types of validity that are relevant to an IO psychologist's work. Just as we can evaluate the reliability of tests and measures, we can also analyze their validity. When someone makes a valid point, what does that usually mean? That they have a good point, that their point is accurate. When IO psychologists evaluate the validity of a test, they're trying to figure out whether that test measures what it says it's measuring. Does the intelligence test actually measure intelligence? Or is it measuring personality or knowledge? The validity of a test has to do with its accuracy as well as its comprehensiveness. The statistic we use to assess validity is called a validity coefficient. Technically, it's a correlation between the predictor and the criterion, between a test and some outcome we're trying to measure, between an interview, for example, and future job performance. To calculate a validity coefficient, we go through the process of test validation, the process of determining whether a test accurately and completely measures what it was designed to measure. Let's take a look at the basic steps of test validation before we learn more about the different types of validity that we might assess. We start the test validation process with job analysis. We identify the job demands, things like work activities, knowledge, skills, abilities, educational and certification requirements. Once we've collected objective information, then step 2 is to define performance. What does high performance look like? What does it mean to be successful in this job? In doing so, we define the criterion, the outcome variable like job performance, organizational commitment, productivity, creativity, and so on. Variables that define performance for this job. Once we know what the job entails, and once we know what we expect from employees, in step 3, we create our test, our measure. A predictor is a test that attempts to predict the criteria. Predictors predict criteria, but we first have to identify the criteria before we can create the predictors. The final step is to actually validate the test and determine whether or not it's an accurate, comprehensive test. To do this, we use both descriptive and inferential statistics. Essentially, we're testing the hypothesis that there will be a strong, significant relationship between the predictor and the criterion. We might predict, for instance, that people who score low on the predictor will also score low on the criterion. Or we might predict that people who score high on the criterion will then score low on, or we might predict that people who score high on the predictor will score low on the criterion. There are many different types of validity that we might assess. This graphic represents the different types we'll learn about in this lecture. Use this graphic to help you organize the ideas and help you remember the concepts for future classes. Construct validity is a representation of how well the test measures the construct. A construct is a psychological concept that can be measured. examples of constructs that IO psychologists often study include intelligence, creativity, integrity, physical strength, and the list goes on and on. There are thousands of constructs that we can measure. Imagine you want to create a test for creativity. In order to do that, you have to define creativity. You have to identify what your definition includes and what your definition does not include. You may have to design more than one test to cover different aspects of the construct. In the example at the bottom of this slide, test 1 has the weakest construct validity. There is very little overlap between the test and the construct. Test 2 has the highest construct validity. There's a great deal of overlap between test 2 and the construct, which means that most of test 2 is in fact measuring the construct of interest, in our case, creativity. Test 3 is somewhere in the middle. There are 2 types of construct validity: convergent validity and discriminant validity. Convergent validity has to do with whether 2 tests, 2 predictors, converge on the same construct and measure it similarly. Are 2 different intelligence tests measuring the same concept, the same construct? We hope so, but if Amy's intelligence test isn't correlated with the popular Wechsler Adult Intelligence Test, the WAIS, there may be something wrong with Amy's test. It may not be measuring intelligence. Discriminant validity involves a comparison between 2 predictors that should not be alike. For example, an intelligence test and a physical abilities test. To assess discriminant validity, we compare the correlation between 2 similar tests, 2 intelligence tests, and the correlation between one of those intelligence tests, the one we're trying to validate, and some completely unrelated test, like a physical abilities test. We would expect the 2 IQ tests to be somewhat correlated, at least more so than an intelligence test and a physical abilities test. If that's not the case, once again, something's wrong, something needs to be changed. Let me walk you through a brief example of construct validity and how we might assess it. On the left, you see we have 2 constructs, strength and endurance, 2 qualities that are necessary for police officers. How might we measure each one of these? Let's stick with strength. We could have recruits do a bench dip to assess strength. We could also ask recruits to conduct a dummy drag or a dummy wrestle or a wall climb, or all 3. After we've hired some of those recruits, we would then measure the recruits' performance. When we assess construct validity, we're trying to decide whether or not the bench dip is an accurate and comprehensive way of measuring strength, whether the dummy drag, the wrestle, the wall climb, whether those are accurate and comprehensive measures. So how would we determine this? We can rely on literature reviews, including meta-analyses, as well as information collected through the job analysis process. Criterion-related validity is more complex. It has to do with the correlation between the predictor score and the criterion score. How well does the test predict the criterion? Is it a really good predictor, 75% of the time it's right, or is it rarely right, only 10% of the time? If we create a list of interview questions to ask applicants, we need to validate that list. We validate it by using it to hire employees and then measuring their performance after they've been on the job for some time. We calculate the correlation between their score in the interview and their performance on the job. That correlation tells us how well our list of interview questions predicted job success. Criterion-related validity is the preferred type of validity. It's the strongest piece of evidence in a court of law. There are two types of criterion-related validity that we can assess: predictive validity and concurrent validity. Sometimes we can use more than one predictor to predict a criterion, as shown in the graphic. We might use an interview, a personality test, and a work sample to predict job performance. When we assess criterion-related validity, we can determine how well those three predictors, individually and as a group, predict performance. It may be that two of them do a really good job and the third one is a waste of time and money. When we assess predictive validity, we administer the test at time 1 and then the criterion measure at time 2. We then calculate the correlation between time 1 and time 2 to see, did the test in fact predict performance at time 2? For example, we might administer an assessment center with a group of applicants in the beginning of the year. We then hire some of them, but not using our test, not yet. Then toward the end of the year, we measure the performance of the applicants we hired and look at the correlation between the two measures. If there is evidence of predictive validity, then we can use that test in the next round of hiring. What do we do if we don't have that much time to validate a test? We can assess what is called concurrent validity. We can administer the test to current employees and at the same time measure their current performance. We call it concurrent because we're collecting the data concurrently at the same time from a single group of people. And finally, content-related validity. You'll notice that the graphic on this slide looks a lot like the graphic on an earlier slide. Notice that the center circle is labeled job instead of construct. Content-related validity is similar to construct-related validity. The major difference is with this particular type of validity, we're really focused on whether or not the tests accurately and comprehensively measure the job. With construct validity, it's all about the construct as defined by researchers, the community, the organization. With content-related validity, now we're focused on the job and what the job requires. Sometimes these two types of validity can be very similar. Sometimes what is required by the construct and the job can be similar. A test that has high content-related validity does an excellent job of sampling the work behaviors or the KSAOs required by the job. In order to assess content-related validity, we ask subject matter experts, including job incumbents, people who work in the job, to compare the test and the job. We ask them questions, gather feedback from them. After all, they are subject matter experts. They know the most about the job. Who better to ask whether a test adequately samples a job than people who do the job every day? We do not collect criterion data. In other words, we do not measure performance, and we do not calculate validity coefficients. Content-related validity relies on people and, of course, job analysis.